And we are live. It's so great to be live. Hello to the wonderful author illustrator, Don Tate,
Hello, Mel. Thank you so much for this opportunity to have a conversation with you this morning
and with the world.
and with the road and all the way from Israel, right?
Yeah, where are you sitting now?
I'm
I
in
mean, you're
Aus-
sitting in your office, but where?
I'm in very hot, very humid Austin, Texas, who's dealing with the aftermath of a hurricane right now.
Yeah, and wishing you all well. Um, the people of Texas are dear to me. I just gave a talk there without moving from Tel Aviv. Don, so we're here to celebrate your wonderful new book and to talk about your wonderful career. So now's the time, yes, to wiggle your book around, shake it, um, and talk about it a little bit. You're the illustrator. Go for it.
So yeah, I am the illustrator. It is written by Wade Hudson, who is an author and the publisher of the historic and trailblazing Just Us books. Anyway, so Wade wrote the story The Day Madeir Voted with Nancy Paulson Books. And it's the story of two little boys who go and experience a day voting with their mother. This would have been in 1969 in a very small town in Louisiana. But before they set out for the day, their mother gives them the history of African Americans and many of the barriers that African Americans had to face trying to vote.
As a Jewish kid growing up in Canada in the 1950s and 60s, suffering a lot of prejudice and hate, I read your book and I almost cried. Do you want to guess which spread made me almost cry?
Well, I'll tell you my favorite spread, and the spread that made me emotional was the last spread, if I can quickly turn to it. So the story fast forwards to the day when the boys actually grow up and they get to vote with their mother during the 2008 election, and they get to vote for an African American person for the very first time. And on this spread, Barack Obama is proclaimed the winner, the 44th president of the United States. And I say that that was an emotional, this was an emotional spread for me because I remember how emotional I felt on the night when Barack Obama became the president of the United States. That was nothing that I ever thought I would see in my lifetime. And to this day, Barack Obama cannot come on TV where I don't get a little misty eyed.
Amazing. So, but my favorite spread is or the most poignant one for me, is the one with the jelly beans.
Oh, yeah.
Can you show us that spread for the people who can see the interview and
Yes.
read it? I was floored.
So I will read the page. So this is basically Madeir and the boys are going to set out to vote. But before they do, she gives them again the history of some of the history of African Americans and the challenges that we faced. Madeir had explained to us that before today, many obstacles had been put up to prevent Black folks from voting. There were poll taxes and reading tests. There was even a test where people had to correctly guess the number of jelly beans in a jar. And so you have this woman here who is trying to get this in front of everyone, trying to guess the number of jelly beans inside the jar. I'm not going to get this straight. But can you imagine showing up at the polls, ready to cast your vote, and being put a great big jar of jelly beans in front of you and being told that you have to guess the number of jelly beans in the jar before you can participate in the process? I
So,
can't even
yeah,
imagine.
so there's a lot of legitimate pain that the Black community in America has for centuries of abuse and misuse and prejudice and slavery and evil. Is this ever going to go away? Is there ever going to be a day when this vanishes and people can, I don't know, get on with their lives?
I feel hopeful. I am certainly not going to stop, using my voice and advocating for change. And I think that is where books like this, The Day Madeira Voted, can be helpful because we are helping to inspire young people to get active in the process early in life. There are things that children can do. Oftentimes kids will feel powerless. Kids can understand feeling that the world is unfair, but there are things that they can do. They have a voice. They can speak up, and they can learn about the process today so that when they do become voters, they can become informed voters.
Is this book for white children as much as it is for Afro American children?
This is a book for all children. It's a book for African American children to be able to see themselves, to be able to open up a book and learn about their history, to be able to learn about the achievements that African Americans have made in this country, but it's also a book that serves as a window for non-African American kids to be able to learn about other people and the struggles that other people have faced. This type of a story is how children can learn to empathize with each other. And this is why stories are valuable. This is how we learn about each other, through each other's stories.
Incredible. So, what's your story, Don Tate? How did you gravitate from talk about your young childhood to this wonderful enterprise of writing and illustrating books for young children?
Well, I was always the kind of kid who liked to keep my fingers busy making things. I was the kind of kid who would make toys from junk that I found around the house. So something simple like an empty toilet paper roll, I would, look at that, not going to throw this away. This is pretty cool. I can turn this into a choo-choo train. Or an old sock. I'm not going to throw the old sock out. I can turn this old sock into a puppet. So I was always making things and creating things. I actually thought that I was going to grow up to become the black Jim Henson, who created puppets because I liked making puppets so much. Um, but I was inspired later on by the TV show Good Times. You remember Good Times? Okay, that featured an African American family. This family had a lot of challenges, and this show was popular in the 70s. And there weren't a lot of television shows on in the 70s that featured Black families. So naturally, I was attracted to this television show. But whatever was happening in this family, JJ, the teenage artist, was in the background painting pictures. And that inspired me because that's how it was in my family. I was always in the background of my family's problems, creating pictures. In a later episode, JJ became an art director for an advertising agency. He became a commercial artist. And I started researching a commercial artist. What is a commercial artist? I was never the kind of artist who liked to paint pictures that you could hang on your wall. I've always been the kind of artist who wanted to use my art for some kind of a product. So commercial art was a natural path for me. And after college, I started working for an educational publishing company where I fell in love with the idea of using my artwork to help children learn how to read.
Well, hold on a second. What did you study art in college? What did you study?
So in college, I went to a 2-year community college where I studied commercial art and advertising.
Okay.
So logos, layouts, color theory, design, which helped me to get the job as a book designer at Perfection Learning, which was an educational publishing company, where I would travel to reading conferences like International Reading Association, and I met librarians and I met teachers who felt just as passionate about raising literacy rates amongst children as I did. And I fell in love with the idea of using my illustrations to help kids learn how to read.
So, how did you morph from um, being a someone who worked for a publisher to someone who worked with publishers?
So at the time, I was getting educational projects from educational publishers from all throughout the country, which became a conflict of interest. Excuse me. So I decided it was time for me to step out and start my own freelance illustration business.
Was this dangerous? Like, was it risky?
It probably was, but I've never been the type person I've never been the type person to really look back.
How old were
That was
you when
my goal.
when this change happened, Don?
This would have been in my early 20s. So I
Wow.
was working at Perfection Learning when I was in my early 20s. And I mean, I shouldn't say that I wasn't like I just jumped off a cliff. Excuse me.
No, you can say that. It makes a better story.
It wasn't like I just jumped off of a cliff. Um, I was illustrating for educational publishers all throughout the country. Um, and then I started working for newspapers. I worked for the Des Moines Register, creating infographics. I worked for the Austin American Statesman, creating infographics. Infographics are basically stories in the newspaper that are told with maps, charts, graphs, and illustrations. And I absolutely hated it. Okay, because you're storytelling, but you're telling stories about people who were in auto accidents or people who died in fires or people who, lost all their money on the stock market or something. Those are not the kind of stories that I wanted to tell. So I continued to moonlight the children's publishing on the side. And then my very first trade book came in 2000 with the
Wow.
book. Let me see if I have the book here. I do. Say Hey, a Song of Willie Mays, which is about baseball great Willie Mays. It's written by Peter Mandel, who was the reporter, and a Willie Mays fan. And this was a dream come true for me because I was able to illustrate this book for Andrea Pinkney, my dream editor. She was an editor at Jump of the Sun under the umbrella of Hyperion. And had been a longtime fan of her and her husband Brian Pinkney, and so this was a pretty cool opportunity for me.
That's a great picture. Can you show some other pictures from the book?
Yeah, so this book is one that I illustrated using oil paints. I haven't actually illustrated in oils in years.
Wow. Wow.
And
Wow.
actually, when I go back and look at some of the artwork that I created in oils, I think maybe I ought to return to creating artwork in oils because I love this medium.
Don, that's incredible. You're in your 20s when you did that?
I was in my well, actually, this was 2000, so I was well past my 20s by by this time. Um,
It's still
yeah.
incredible. Still
Well,
incredible.
thank you.
Wow. Wow. So and then what happened?
So the book published in 2000. It's been about one to two books per year since then. I primarily focus on telling the stories of little known African American heroes. So, for instance, Swish, which is a more recent book published or written by my friend Suzanne Slade,
And
which is
by my friend also, she was on the program. Prolific
made this
writer,
connection between
and
the two
she
of us, right?
connected us. Thank you,
Yes.
Susan. Well done.
So this is the story of the Harlem Globetrotters, a high school basketball team who dreamed of playing professional sports. But at that time, African Americans weren't allowed to play professional sports. So do you think they give up? They gave up? No, they started a team of their own and called themselves the New York Harlem Globetrotters, and they challenged
Weren't they
teams.
from Chicago?
They were a high school basketball team from Chicago. You see, they thought that Harlem sounded more big and worldwide than the Chicago Globetrotters. So they called themselves the Harlem Globetrotters, the New York Harlem Globetrotters. And here they are. This is a scene in the book where they are in the locker room and they are not giving up, but they are starting a team of their own. Another book, because now I do focus on stories about little known African American heroes, but I also don't want to put myself in a box. When I visit elementary schools, I want kids to know that I'm an African American man who writes and illustrates children's books, but I can write and illustrate what I want to write about. And so I decided that I wanted to write a story about a Victorian bodybuilder. This guy's name is Eugene Sandow, and he's known as the strongest man on earth. I wrote this book after participating in natural bodybuilding myself. And actually, I'm going to share something with you. Give me a second. I'm going to go grab this out of the corner. I want to share this with you. This is my bodybuilding trophy that I won some years ago. It's on
Wow.
stage, posing. I won that trophy, and I decided that I wanted to write a story about bodybuilding, but I figure fifth graders don't bodybuild, so I didn't really have a story, right? But then I found an image of Eugene Sandow on the internet. And let me see if I can find the image here that I actually used. This is the image of Sandow that inspired the book.
Hmm.
So I did my research and I learned that Eugene Sandow, when he was a kid, he was sickly, he was weak, and he wanted to get healthy. So he worked on his health and he grew up to become known as one of the strongest men on earth.
Wow.
I just love these stories that haven't been told that kids aren't familiar with.
And this one you wrote.
This is one that I wrote and illustrated.
Okay, so in our little talk before we came on, because you are a prolific illustrator of wonderful books, but you are also, I lost track of how many, 40, 50, 60 books. Who can keep
Well,
track?
I often say that I've written and or illustrated more than 90 books
There you
because
go.
I started off in educational publishing and majority of that was illustrating, 16 page, 8 page, 16-page basal readers, which are books. They're just smaller books, but they're books that are used in the classroom to teach kids to learn how to read.
Yeah, but even trade publishing, you've, I'm guessing 40, 50, 60 books. It's incredible.
Yes, I often tell people I've been in this, it's kind of scary and it makes me sound old. I've been in this business for nearly 40 years. So I've done a lot of bookmaking. It's very fun work. I enjoy what I
Yeah,
do.
you look very young. We're not going to talk about age. I think that people that are in this, I wanted to say business, Don, but it's not really a business, is it? Um,
You know what? It is a business, but it's fun business. It's fun work. I mean, I get to create stories, I get to tell history, I get to inspire kids, I get to offer kids a map for navigating the future. That's one of the cool things about all of these stories is that they offer children stories about people who have faced obstacles and have overcome obstacles. Um, and so kids can use these stories to navigate their own issues or problems or things that they may come across in their own lives.
Absolutely. It's a kind of I look at it as a kind of a church or synagogue, if you will. Um, and it is a lot of fun. Before we came on, I asked you whether you see yourself, because you write and you illustrate, but up until now, let's say most you've illustrated, and this new book is one that you've illustrated, and then you tell me that now you're morphing into writing. And I'll tell you what intrigues me because I write, but I can't draw a stick man. How does this work for you guys? Explain.
Well, again, I started off my career as an illustrator, but then I moved to Austin in right around 2000, and I joined the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators (SCBWI). And my writer friends encouraged me to learn how to write or to write a book. But I was afraid of words. I was afraid of trying to write because I, was an artist. I thought that I'm supposed to paint pretty pictures. I didn't see myself as someone who was good with words. I often tripped over my words. I used bad grammar. To this, as you can see in this interview, I don't speak perfect Queen's English. I have a few quirks in in the way that I speak, and so I thought the last thing that I want to do is write a book for someone, and especially someone's kids. Um,
Don,
but
your English is spectacular.
thank you.
I'm
But
jealous of your English.
what I learned through the process is that my quirky way of speaking, my imperfect way of speaking, is the personality that I leave on the page for
Wow.
my readers.
Wow.
Every book has a very unique voice, and I often tell kids that if you read all the books in my library and they all had the same voice, reading would be very boring. So I wrote every day, put my imperfect voice into my writing. And my very first book, let me see. I don't know if you can see it over there on the end, but it's called It Just Happened. When Bill Traylor Started to Draw, was published by Lee and Low Books. And when my editor acquired it, she said, Don, we're going to publish this book because we love your unique voice.
Incredible.
And so I've been writing ever since then. I love writing just as much as I love illustrating.
Wow. And so how long does it take you to illustrate a picture book? An average time.
Well, it's varied over the years. When Andrea first offered me the opportunity to illustrate, say, hey, she said, can you illustrate this book in a year? And I said, sure. So for my first few books, it was right around about a year. And then I started to get faster, and then the deadlines started to get shorter. And then I went digital. What you can't see now, right here in front of me, is a 32-inch Cintiq, which is like a 32-inch iPad that I actually draw and paint on. And it allows me to work faster, more efficiently. And so now I'm expected to turn a book around in 8 months, 6 months, sometimes 2 or 3 months. So it's like the more tools that we get, and the faster that we get, we're also expected to turn around work even faster. So I would say now that my average book is around, I don't know, 4 or 5 months to illustrate.
It's still quite a long time considering the advances that the industry pays. But we're not going to go into that right now.
You're probably
Illustrators are underpaid. They're sometimes underregarded, and that is terrible. And we have to fight that.
But
Which
I
is
will say this, I don't depend upon paying my mortgage through my illustrations. I often advise illustrators, don't put all your eggs in one basket. So I illustrate books, I write books, I visit elementary schools where I get paid to visit elementary schools. I speak at conferences. I'm going to Honesdale, Pennsylvania this weekend to teach at Highlights, which is a writing workshop for adults who aspire to learn how to write children's books.
I will be there in September. Maybe I'll see you.
Uh, that would be so cool. Yeah, that would be so cool. So, yeah, so I kind of spread things around because I know that if I depended simply on children's book illustration royalties to pay my bills, I'd be living out there across the street on on the sidewalk.
Exactly. So we're not going to talk too much more about that. But here's another thing.
Yes.
People think, and I also thought at the beginning of my writing journey, that it's easy to write a picture book. You take a piece of paper and a pen or pencil. Um, it's only 500 words or so. How difficult can that be? And for me, it takes years and over 50 revisions to write
Oh,
a
yes.
decent manuscript. So how does it go for you?
You know,
If it takes you half a year to illustrate a book, how long does it take you to write one?
yeah, kids are always surprised when I tell them that with my books, that typically, I revise them. I write them, I revise them, and sometimes I revise them 50, 60, 70, 80 or more times. Um, every one of my books have been a little bit different. A book like William Still and His Freedom Stories. Let me see if I can pick it up here. So William Still and His Freedom Stories is a book about a African American man, a free African American man who helped hundreds of enslaved people escape north on the Underground Railroad. took me a couple of years to write and rewrite this book, because the research was there was so much to research, and there were so many layers to this story. And each time I thought that I found the core of the story, I would discover more layers. However, with the Sandow book, believe it or not, it took me a week to write this story, 1 week to revise it, and another month to sell it. So all of this happened all inside of maybe, I don't know, less than 3 months from the time that I sat down to write the story until the story published. So each story varies. No matter whether it takes me 2 weeks or 2 years to write a story, it still takes another 2, 3, sometimes even 4 years to work with the publisher at revising it back and forth. I have a book that
Absolutely.
I sold in 2020. And this is the story of Dudley Randall, who was a poet who published many poets during the Black Arts Movement of the 1960s. Again, I sold that book in 2020. The book was supposed to publish in 2024, then 2025, then I was told 2026, and the last I heard was 2027. So there's been a lot of back and forth revision. And because I'm not illustrating the book, there's a lot of back and forth revision
Yeah.
between
Let,
illustrator.
let me jump in and ask you about that. I noticed that once in a while you're the author and not the illustrator.
Well,
How did that work for you?
I love that. It gives me the flexibility to choose how I'm going to work. There are some books that I most definitely want to author and illustrate. With the Sandow book, that was my lived experience. I had so much fun researching that story. That was a book that I wanted to write and illustrate. I have a book coming out that is about the first African American meteorologist who were Tuskegee Airmen. That book's going to come out with Learner. I was very excited to write that story. I was a little bit less excited about illustrating P-51, you know, airplanes. Airplanes are not necessarily my thing, so I am really excited that artist David Cooper is going to be illustrating those P-51 bombers or whatever, because
So,
that's yeah.
so this is yeah. So I need to jump in here and ask you another thing that
Yeah.
just bugs me. So if I were an illustrator, right,
Yes.
that also wrote, and wouldn't I tend to write about things that I can draw rather than whatever I want to write about? Does that happen? Like, I want to write a story about a giraffe, but I'm not really fond of drawing giraffes. So I turned it into a story about a hedgehog, even though it should be a story about a giraffe.
Doesn't really happen that way for me. For me, it's typically more of a business decision. As a writer, I mean, I can write more stories than I can illustrate. It takes a long time to do illustrations. So I've got a kid in law school, and so I need to think more business wise. So at this point in my life, I'm able to produce more stories as a writer than I can as an illustrator. But again, because I am an illustrator, there are certain stories that I am most definitely going to want to illustrate. But I love having the freedom to be able to pick and choose. I sent off 4 ideas to an editor yesterday that I'm going to write. And I haven't decided whether or not they are stories that I want to illustrate also. I'll make that decision once the offers come in and what my schedule looks like and what my bank account is looking like.
Hold on. So what's it? So you sell the stories yourself? You're not agented?
No, I do have an agent. So yeah, I misspoke there. So yes, I do work through an agent. My agent is Karen Wiseman of the Andrea Brown
Ah,
Literary Agency.
Karen Wiseman. I know her.
Wiseman,
Hi,
she's
Karen.
wonderful.
Yes, she is wonderful. She's more wonderful than you know. She's not my agent, but she's wonderful.
Well, what I
Um,
like about working with Karen is that before I send a manuscript out to an editor and to the world, Karen looks over it carefully and she offers me some editorial feedback. So she works with me to develop that manuscript to get it ready for prime time before we send it out into the world. So not every creator likes to work that way, but Karen works that way with me, and that's what, that's what works for me.
And so she works with you on it, and then she sends it to the editor, or you send it to the editor.
And she sends it to the editor, and then she works to negotiate offers that come in. And in the same with, she represents my illustrations as well. So maybe a publisher reaches out to Karen and says, like in the case of Wade Hudson's book, hey, we'd like Don Tate to illustrate the day Medea voted. What does the schedule look like? They make the offer, she negotiates all of that, and then yeah, so she's been absolutely a perfect agent for me.
So now I'm going to ask how you found her, or
Oh,
how she
that is
found you.
a long and winding and tangled road. I had been represented by
In
several,
two sentences, Don.
well, I had been represented by several agents that just didn't quite work out for me. I I did this the wrong way. I'm not going to advise you to do it this way. You don't get an agent this way. But I reached out to Andrea Brown Literary Agency on Facebook and I said, would you want to be my agent? And they said, well, maybe. And long story short, it just worked out. But again, that's not the way you go about getting an agent. And I don't advise you to do so.
I must say, after interviewing over 170 authors and illustrators, I'm not sure there is a right way.
That's true. Everyone has
The
a very
the,
different path.
the odds are like, so against you.
Yeah,
So
but again, the agents at Andrea Brown would very much appreciate if you not reach out to them through Facebook.
no, absolutely. But once in a blue moon,
Yes.
when there is the magic, and the planets are all aligned, it does happen. So let's go back to your brand new book, and let's celebrate a little bit more, open it up, read a little bit, um, and shout out to Nancy Paulson and her wonderful imprint.
So I'll do a little bit of reading from the front and talk a little bit about the illustrations, maybe for the first few spreads. Today was the day our mother had been looking forward to. She was wearing one of her best dresses, even though it was Tuesday. And this image was inspired by my own grandmother's foyer from the 1960s. You sure look
This often happens, and I guessed it. That very often the illustrators will come in and they'll draw their own home and their own family and their own background. I
as
love it.
well as writers. When I visit elementary schools, I often tell the kids that authors and illustrators, we put our own life, our own experiences into the stories that we write and illustrate because that makes our words and our images more authentic.
Absolutely. And as writers, I mean, you know this better than I. One of my difficulties along the way was leaving enough space. All we do when we write is like a scaffold for you guys. That's all we do.
Exactly. It's a marriage between the words and the pictures, and where the words don't tell the story completely, the illustrations can then finish off the story and add additional information. For
No.
instance, on this opening spread that I showed you, which I said was my grandmother's foyer, there's a lot of information in this image that is communicated to my young readers that is not in the story. You can see Dr. King on the wall in the background. Okay, that tells you that Dr. King was a very important figure to this family during the 1960s. You can see the old-fashioned rotary
He
telephone.
was. I gotta say, he was an important person
Most
for us all,
for so yes,
for
yes.
Jewish kids growing up, and for anybody who I just I taught him on Tuesday that one day my four children will be judged not by the color of the skin, but by their character, something like that. Wow, what a
Yeah,
guy.
yeah. So the illustrations, they extend the story. They give the reader more information. You sure look nice, I told her as she fixed our breakfast. Madeira's going to vote. Madeira's going to vote, my little brother Charlie chanted. Finally, Madeira said. And so you can see in this illustration, the family is sitting around at breakfast. So
So
one of the,
Don, who are the people?
so this
Who's
is
Nadir? Who are the
the
children?
mother. The mother's name is Madeira.
Yeah.
Madeira is a name that historically a lot of African Americans would refer to the matriarch of the family, combines mother and dear, Madeira.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and so the two little boys are Charlie and Ralph. Ralph is the older boy.
Hmm.
And one of the things that I thought about in this image when I first created the character of Madeira, I created a woman, a church-looking woman with the straight hairstyle and a church hat. And then I started to think about my own mother during the 1960s. My mother stopped straightening her hair and she grew out an afro because afro was a symbol of Black pride. And a lot of African American ladies stopped straightening their hair and wore a big, proud afro. And so I wanted to include that in the image. So I created an image of Madeira with a big, proud afro. So that's just another example of me adding to Wade's story about what was going on in the 1960s.
I would, Don, I would venture to say, because it's obvious in your illustrations that this is your story. And this is what I think that after interviewing so many authors, that if you are lucky, you talked about a marriage, but when an author is super lucky to get a traditional publishing deal, it's a marriage where they don't see the bride till after the ceremony.
That's
Um,
a
and,
scary analogy there.
no, because you don't see the pictures, you know you're going
Yes.
to love them, but you're not really party to the artist that worked. Don't bother me. Let me do my thing. It'll be great, and I'll show you when I'm finished. But I venture to say that this is, and you tell me as an illustrator if you experience this, is that if you don't feel that this is going to be your story, you're going to have trouble illustrating. Or am I wrong?
Oh, definitely, most definitely. There, and I won't say which books, but there have been books that I've illustrated. Um, and again, I have 90 plus, so there's a lot to guess from. There have been some books that I've illustrated simply because income. Okay, I wasn't necessarily excited about the story, but this was a book to illustrate, and you can see that I wasn't real excited. So I'm at a place today in my career where I only accept manuscripts that I am truly excited about because I want that excitement to come through in my illustrations.
Incredible.
And so much of myself goes into the illustrations. We were talking about, putting you were talking about so much of it is my story. I'll give you an example. So on this page of the story, the family sets out and they're at the polling station where Madeira is going to vote. This is a very busy scene where the author compares this scene to being at church. I remember this scene when I was a kid. My mom would take my brother and I to the polling stations with her when she went to vote. And they were always busy with our next door neighbors, and the guy who lives across the street was one of the polling workers. And it was a very happy, cheerful, neighborly kind of an environment. And when I illustrated the scene in the book, I poured those memories into the scene. That was
Wow.
my experience.
Don, what's your interaction with the author?
It depends.
No, here in
Tip,
this, in this in the book we're celebrating today.
well, with this book, I pretty much did not interact with the author at all when I illustrated the book. And actually, the author was simply trying to respect, Wade was simply trying to respect my place as the illustrator. I mean, he didn't want to art direct me. And initially, I reached out to him. I was
Even
like,
though
Wade,
he's a publisher, it's like,
even though he's a publisher, but he kind of knows and wanted to respect the publishing rules. I had reached out to him and I said, "Wait, can you send me a picture of yourself and your mom when from that time period in your life? I'd like to base the images on you." And he said, "No, I would rather not do that. Um, and he was simply trying to, because the story is inspired by his mother and his lived experience, but he wanted me to create the characters based upon my imagination. He was respecting the process.
Please write him and tell him that I would love to interview him as well.
I'll certainly do that. Yes.
It's a wonderful book, and it's full of sentiment, and it pulls at the heartstrings of people who felt injustice in different ways, um, and uh, and I really applaud you. I wish I could just reach out across the Zoom and give you a great big hug.
Well, I
It,
will
it, it,
that Wade wrote the day Madeira voted while he was writing a middle grade novel. The middle grade novel is called Defiance, and it is his experience growing up in the Jim Crow South and some of his activism work as a young person. And so Wade would most definitely be a great person to have a conversation with because he can talk in depth about his experiences during the civil rights movement.
Wonderful. So, Don, do we have like 2 more minutes?
Certainly.
I know you're a busy guy, and I promised 40 minutes, but it's so much fun interviewing you. What are your tips for aspiring authors and illustrators?
It's going to be really very, very boring tips. But if you're a writer, you have to write. You know what I'm saying? I've met so many people who tell me, "Oh, I've got this wonderful children's story and I want to get published and I want to do this and I want to do that." And I'm like, "Have you written anything?" Well, I know I've not written it down. So you're not a writer unless you write your story. And the same with illustrating. If you want to become an illustrator, well, you need to sit down at your sketch pad, sit down at your iPad, sit down at your 32-inch Cintiq and draw. Polish your illustrations, create the best illustrations that you can, develop yourself as a writer. Um, you have to, like what Jane Yolen says, famously says, butt in chair and get the work done.
Hmm. Absolutely. So, Don, we're coming to the end of our conversation. I had a wonderful time. So everybody run out and buy this brand new book, which is 2 days old,
2 days old.
from Nancy Paulson Books, The Day Madeira Voted. Wonderful. And I have with me the illustrator of this book and the author of many other books,
Can I add
Don
one
Tate.
thing?
You can
Can I
act
add?
like I'm setting you free to go out and do your important business, man. You can
So
say three things.
I have a newsletter, which I'm
Okay.
going to send out a new newsletter either today or tomorrow, and I'm going to send these free posters. These posters can go along with the book. So I'm going to send out 20 of these posters. I'll send 2 posters per person to those who sign up for the newsletter. So sign up for the newsletter, and the first 20 people to do that will get a couple of posters mailed to them. So
And Don, I will add that I was so excited to meet you, greet you, and interview you. But I forgot to introduce the program.
oh,
So so hi everybody.
we
I'm
love
Mel
our work.
Rosenberg.
That's why we love our work so much that we forget the little details. Like,
Yeah, so here's the introduction at the end. Hi, everybody. I'm Mel Rosenberg, and I am the host of the Children's Literature Channel for the New Books Network. And I've been speaking to the wonderful author illustrator, Don Tate. So,
thank
Don,
you, Bill.
we're run out and buy the book. It's wonderful. And Don, come out and go back in, and we'll have a little entre nous. And for
All right.
everybody else, take care and love humanity and buy picture books, especially this one launched 2 days ago. Don, see you in a
Thank you,
minute.
Bill. See you in a minute.
Everybody else, see you next week.